Thank you, Steve. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you today, and I'm very honored to be elected into the Academy this year. So most of the work that I've done over the last 16 years at the University of South Carolina has been focused on trying to understand barriers and enablers to physical activity in understudied groups, and also in trying to develop and implement and then evaluate behavior change interventions to reach both individuals, but also more of my work has been in the area of communities and trying to make community change. So today, there's going to be some overlap with Larry's talk. I'm going to talk about the importance of behavior theory in interventions with older adults, and in particular, I'll emphasize social cognitive theory. I'm going to talk about the recommended strategies and techniques for increasing physical activity in older adults, and they're based on these theories. And I'm going to highlight some of my research as an example of how behavioral constructs can be studied to really better understand the influences on physical activity behavior in the older adult. And then I'll end giving some recommendations for some gaps in the behavioral intervention literature. So when you think about interventions to increase physical activity in any population, but especially in older adults, you can think of different approaches. So a lot of senior centers or community centers implement group-based programs. They're very popular, they're group exercise programs, but they largely involve people coming in and taking part in an exercise program, and they rarely include the components that Larry just outlined very nicely. Social support is often provided, but it's more through an encouraging leader and maybe through seeing kind of the same people. If you've taken part in group exercise, you may not know the people always, but you recognize them, and there's something to that. In contrast, interventions that are based on behavior change theories really focus on teaching people those strategies and skills and techniques to adopt and maintain an active lifestyle. And so Larry talked about many of the examples, self-monitoring, helping people problem solve, and so on. So in a number of the review papers that have been done, interventions based on the theoretical model are more effective than interventions that are not based on theory. And so in an older review, for example, with older adults, Kahn found that 70% of studies that used a theory were effective in getting people more active, getting older adults more active, versus only 40% of those studies that weren't based on a theory. Yet, review after review in all sorts of different literatures, but including older adults, show that many intervention studies don't cite or use a theory. And so about 60% in the Kahn review cited the use of a behavior theory, and only about 45% in a more recent review paper of older adults used a theory to guide the intervention. And then when theory is used or cited, often it's incomplete in that some theoretical constructs are targeted and others are not. And of those review papers, almost always social cognitive theory comes out as the most commonly applied theoretical framework. So Larry, you can just kind of turn off your head right now. But for those of you who are less familiar with theory, I'm just going to talk a little bit about social cognitive theory. So within social cognitive theory, human behavior, like physical activity, is really explained in terms of this dynamic and reciprocal model where behavior, personal factors, and environmental influences, which can be both the social and the physical environment, all interact. And some of the critical personal factors are kind of expecting some of the outcomes from being active, or outcome expectations, learning by observing others, this sort of role modeling, the confidence to perform behaviors, or the self-efficacy and confidence to overcome barriers, and then also the ability to self-regulate or self-control behavior. Oops, sorry. And so consistent with many of the constructs of social cognitive theory, the American College of Sports Medicine issued a best practices statement for physical activity programs and behavior counseling in older adults. And the statement identified 7 behavioral factors that are associated with both initiating and maintaining physical activity. So you've heard a lot about social support already, and I would say, and self-efficacy, those are really the most commonly studied constructs in most theories of behavior change. And they may be especially important for older adults who may not get as much support to be active. You know, sometimes family members say, take it easy, don't hurt yourself. You've reached a point in your life where you need to rest. And also they may be experiencing a loss of control due to changes in health, the loss of others. And so the self-efficacy and social support may really be critical there. Active choices really refers to tailoring the program to meet the needs, the interests, and the capabilities of the older adult. And when you have a good match between the person and the program, that's another way that you can really enhance self-efficacy. Health contracts are written agreements between the participant and the health professional, and they usually include goal setting as well as self-monitoring or tracking of behavior, and that also can enhance self-efficacy. Something that may be a little bit unique to older adults or other groups who may need some adaptations are addressing some of the concerns about the perceived risks of being active. So kind of understanding intensity levels, what it should and what it should not feel like are important with this population. It's important to provide regular feedback, and that can be helpful for the older adult to develop realistic expectations as well as progress in the program. And then finally, positive reinforcements can be both tangible reinforcements, like incentives or rewards, or less tangible things, like maybe personal recognition of attendance or so on. The thing about these strategies is they really can be applied irrespective of the mode of the intervention. So we're doing some work now trying to see how can you incorporate these into more technology-based interventions. So a lot of people use these apps, but they're really devoid of any kind of behavioral theory, except for self-monitoring usually. You can use them in telephone models, group models, even mail-based or print media, if y'all remember what that was like. All right. So as I mentioned, self-efficacy and social support are the most commonly studied constructs in physical activity behavior research. And these constructs are really consistently and positively associated with physical activity in adults, including older adults. But a lot of that work showing their associations has been cross-sectional. So I'm going to use an example from some of the work that I've done in the Active for Life initiative to show how we examined these two variables both as potential moderators as well as mediators of behavior change. And also I'm choosing to highlight the Active for Life initiative because it really still remains one of the few translational studies in the intervention area conducted with older adults. So let me start with a brief overview of Active for Life. So this was an initiative funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to examine the translation of 2 evidence-based physical activity programs into community settings. And they were delivered by diverse community-based organizations. So these organizations applied for this funding, and they were selected to implement one of 2 intervention programs. Active Choices was a 6-month telephone-based program. So in this program, the participants all had a face-to-face session, but then the rest of the intervention was delivered entirely by brief telephone counseling. All participants received a pedometer, tracking calendar, and a resource guide. Active Living Every Day was a 20-week lifestyle physical activity program. So in this program, the participants received a workbook, a pedometer, tracking tools, but the program was delivered in small groups. But one thing to note is that there was no exercise in any of the groups. So it was really focused on learning these behavioral strategies and skills to adopt and maintain an active lifestyle. And both of the programs were grounded in social cognitive theory and the trans-theoretical model. So really a lot of theoretical overlap, but delivered in different modalities. Active for Life was a quasi-experimental pre-post study design. The selected community organizations that are shown on the right side of the slide here enrolled just over 8,000 midlife and older adults who were either underactive or inactive, And the sites all got to implement the program of their choice. So be kind of careful with comparing programs. The participants were somewhat different, and sites also chose which type of program they wanted to put into place. Both programs resulted in significant and moderately sized effect sizes for physical activity. And interestingly, the effect sizes were very comparable to the initial efficacy studies on which these two programs were based. And consistent with really the whole purpose of the translational research, the participants looked a lot more like real older adults. So in the telephone-based model, I think it was about, let's see, 40% of participants were non-Hispanic white, so a majority were of different races and ethnicities. In the group-based model, about 60% were non-Hispanic white, so we did have a lot of diversity, both in terms of race, ethnicity, as well as education and chronic health conditions. So there were very few exclusions for participants to take part. So in this analysis of Active for Life data, we tried to look at whether there were baseline characteristics that predicted how well a participant did in the program. So you can kind of think of these as similar to moderating variables. And I'm going to show you the data for both social support and self-efficacy, even though we looked at a wider range of variables. So if you look here, the telephone-based model on the left, you can see that baseline level of social support was related to outcome in physical activity. So participants who enrolled in the program with lower levels of social support did not do as well as participants who entered the program with higher levels of social support. But I will note that even those with low social support saw moderate effect sizes in change, so they still benefited from the program. You can see in the group-based model that social support was really unrelated to how well they did in the program over time. And so one caveat is that in the telephone-based model, participants had higher levels of social support than in the group-based model. So it may be some of the people who seek out a group-based intervention have less support, maybe feel a little bit more isolated, and really do benefit from that group cohesion, group support that Larry spoke about. This shows the relationship between baseline self-efficacy and change in physical activity. And although it looks like you see a pattern, these were actually non-significant. So baseline levels of self-efficacy really didn't predict statistically how well a participant did with the program. But you do see that if you entered the program with lower self-efficacy, on average, people had larger effect sizes. And I think that's due to the fact that people with really low levels of self-efficacy were quite a bit less active, so they just probably had more room for change in the program. Both of the programs really emphasize setting realistic, achievable goals, building on these small successes, and these are factors that we really know lead to increased self-efficacy. And so, I think, as you'll see in a minute, it's, I think, a very important program or component of the interventions. Okay, so the predictor or moderator analyses don't really tell us if social support and self-efficacy are the drivers of change in physical activity. We target lots of things in these interventions, and so what's really accounting for the change? So Katie Bukowski, one of my former doctoral students, conducted some mediation analyses to explore the role of social support and self-efficacy in actually producing these changes in physical activity. So for these analyses, we used McKinnon's product of coefficient method to test for mediation. So we first did a single mediation model where we looked at whether the dose of the intervention predicted a change in social support or self-efficacy, and whether that change related to change in physical activity. And in the multiple mediator model, we simultaneously tested social support and self-efficacy, so they essentially control for one another. But we're really looking here at the alpha pathway, so does our intervention change the potential mediator, and our beta pathway, does that change in self-efficacy relate to change in physical activity? So these are the mediation results for active choices. And you can see that in the single mediation model, first looking at social support, we did not find that having more telephone calls was related to greater social support. It was not significant. But those who did increase their social support did see a greater increase in physical activity. And so, and testing the product of the coefficients did not provide support for mediation. However, for self-efficacy, we found both the alpha and the beta pathways significant, and we did find support that essentially the effect on physical activity occurred through self-efficacy, at least partially. And these results were held up in the multiple mediation analysis. For active living every day, the group-based model, we did find support in the single mediator model for social support. So attending more groups led to an increase in social support. That increase in social support led to increased physical activity, and our criteria for mediation was met. And the same pattern for self-efficacy. It sure would be cleaner if it was exactly the same here. Oops, and I apologize, one of these should not be significant. Or no, these actually all the paths were significant in the multiple mediation model, but the coefficient here did not provide support for mediation, but it was close. So what these studies really show is that regardless of program format, increasing self-efficacy seems to be a really critical factor in older adults in increasing physical activity. Social support, again, was important, really more only in the group-based program. And it seems like there's something that even though the telephone counselor provides the support and actually focuses on helping the participant reach out and seek support in their community, it didn't seem to be as powerful as having that group model. Larry actually talked a lot about this already. So, you notice in those strategies that the American College of Sports Medicine put out, they actually didn't really emphasize self-regulation. And I think actually measuring these variables has been understudied in our research. So these include things like intention formation, getting feedback on performance, self-monitoring, goal setting, and reviewing behavioral goals. And although this is a very correlational type of analysis, I like the approach Michi did in a meta-regression. And essentially, they had 122 studies that used all sorts of different strategies. But they coded in each study, what were the strategies used. And then essentially did an analysis to look at what were the strategies related to the greatest effect size. And what they found was that in interventions that combine self-monitoring with at least one other technique from control theory led to larger intervention effects than interventions that did not use those approaches. So I think those are variables that we really need to probably be studying more and looking at more in things like mediation analyses. Okay, so let me just turn then to some recommendations of what I see as some gaps in the literature. So remember, only about half of physical activity intervention studies cite the use of a behavior theory. And fewer actually measure whether these constructs are accounting for the change in physical activity. So clearly there's a need to increase the use of theory in interventions, both to increase effectiveness of interventions and also to help us just know what are the strategies that really need to be emphasized more than others, especially as we try to move some of these interventions to scale. Very few studies have conducted mediation analyses, especially in older adults. And again, this type of research really helps us to understand the strategies that are more or less effective and hopefully making our interventions more efficient. In the behavioral science literature in general, we often don't look at long-term effects. Partly it's due to our funding mechanisms that we're not funded to look at things long enough. But the studies that have been done in general are not all that encouraging, that we're able to maintain behavior long term. And some people have argued that we might need to be looking at different theories. So many of our theories are working really well for physical activity adoption, but not as well for maintenance. And so there's been an interest in theories like self-determination theory, motivational interviewing, to try to increase the sort of intrinsic motivation people have in behavior change. In order to increase our reach and make more of a public health impact, there's a need to conduct more dissemination and translation studies. So frameworks like RE-AIM help us to think about the public health impact of our work. And I think studying the feasibility and the impact of disseminating some of these behavioral interventions to community settings, again, something that Larry mentioned, where older adults actually spend their time is important. And finally, much of the intervention literature with older adults is limited by its focus on largely white, more educated samples. So increasing diversity is going to help us to not only generalize our results, but hopefully also reach those groups that may have the most to gain from physical activity intervention studies to address some of those health disparities. Okay, so in relation to these last two recommendations, I wanted to just have one slide about some of the work that I'm currently doing. And it really addresses the issues of dissemination as well as diversity. So I direct our CDC-funded Prevention Research Center. And our core research project in this cycle is to look at the dissemination and implementation of a faith-based program that we previously developed and found to be effective at increasing physical activity and fruit and vegetable intake. And this intervention targets policy systems and environmental change within the church setting. If you've been to the South, I'll just give you a quick tutorial. Churches are very important. So it really is a setting where we can reach a lot of people. So we target those systems, but we also do incorporate social cognitive theory in our messaging that the church leaders share with their members. So this study is using a train-the-trainer approach, and I think it has great potential to reach a lot of midlife and older African Americans. The average churchgoer tends to be sort of a midlife to older individual. So we're in the first phase of our project. We are targeting right now one county that has 134 churches. It's a rural county, so 134 churches, about 22,000 residents. And 68, so about half of the churches, have signed up to participate in the study. So we're screening them right now for eligibility. We've trained community health advisors to train the churches, and then the advisors will work with the churches over the next year. And we're using two dissemination and implementation frameworks to really understand that process of dissemination and implementation. And then in phase two, we're going to work with a large statewide religious denomination in South Carolina to look at those dissemination and implementation issues even more broadly across the state. Okay, so it seems fitting at this time when I'm becoming a fellow in the Academy to really acknowledge and gratefully thank the people who've been my teachers, mentors, models, and most importantly, encouragers at my undergraduate, graduate, postdoctoral, and career levels. I was reflecting on this when I added Barb and Russ's name, that when I came for my job interview, you two were the ones who took me out for dinner that first night. So I had a fond memory of that and continue to really be my encouragers. And I'd like to thank all of you for your time and attention.